To build context, the following very partial bibliographic tour should provide some very telling perspective. During the book tour interviews and lecture presentations associated with the release and promotions of his very important 2011 book, Reinventing Fire, renowned energy conservation expert and founding director of the Rocky Mountain Institute, Amory Lovins, repeatedly noted that the transition away from the unsustainable reliance on fossil fuels is not a once-in-a-generation, not a once-in-a-lifetime, not even a once-in-a-century occurrence, but a once-in-a-civilization challenge and opportunity. Let me repeat that. Once-in-a-civilization opportunity. Then in late 2014, author Naomi Klein released a book which also frames the issues related to this transition in civilizational terms, with the highly appropriate title, This Changes Everything, and a subtitle which I will invoke explicitly to help frame the closing thoughts in my final segment. Discussing the complex hierarchy and network of challenges associated with this and related transitions, in a series of important papers and talks, MIT Professor of Management and Engineering Systems with the MIT Systems Dynamics Group, John Sterman, has repeatedly observed that we are rapidly approaching a point where the parts per million levels of greenhouse gases within the Earth's atmosphere will reach concentrations last achieved not decades, not centuries, nor even millennia ago, but millions of years ago, before humans even emerged as a species, let alone before we reached anything like civilization. His important work goes on to examine the complex nesting of feedback loops at various levels and across various social, economic, technological, and political domains, which must be more broadly addressed if we are to effectively negotiate the transition to sustainability. A transition which far transcends merely the need to dissolve our reliance on fossil fuels. Citing the unprecedented levels of coordination and cooperation which this transition will demand, the work of Messrs. Lovins and Sterman and many others strongly intimates that we are in anything but business as usual territory, that the scale and appropriate historic framing of our present circumstance requires concerted strategic and tactical consideration which transcends anything humanity has previously faced in our existence. And it is this reality which entails the choice of the term imperative for the title of this public affairs media venue. In other words, such holistic strategic and tactical coordination is not just some nice, airy-fairy egalitarian thing that we might want to consider if we can manage to get around to it. It is something that we are either going to do, or our very survival as a species will be in very real and very serious jeopardy. Briefly extending the bibliographic sampling, the work of many other serious and thoughtful authors powerfully reinforces this message from a range of different angles. From a purview that considers the broad underlying array of overlapping and mutually interacting social, political, technological, economic, and ecological processes of transformation currently rumbling just within the United States, University of Maryland professor Gar Alperovitz explicitly emphasizes how little attention is given to this incredible profusion of activity by the conventional major media in his important 2013 book, What Then Must We Do? In his 2010 book, The Necessary Revolution, Peter Senge addresses how critical it is for successfully making this great transition that we individually, collectively, and institutionally learn three important lessons. Number one, to see systems. Number two, to collaborate across boundaries. And number three, to define and then create desired futures. And it would be dangerously illusory to imagine that being able to state these lessons so succinctly entails that they would operationally be no sweat, as it were, to actually realize and instantiate. In fact, doing so will be anything but trivial. In their 2011 book, Technology, Globalization, Sustainable Development, Transforming the Industrial State, Director of the MIT Technology and Law Program Nicholas Ashford and co-author Ralph P. Hall provide invaluable perspective on just what fulfilling those three objectives might entail and how non-trivial that would be. David C. Korten, in his book, The Great Turning from Empire to Earth Community, also explicitly places this great transition in the sweeping historical context of human civilizations and their transformations. In his profoundly important work on the true nature and implications of real nanotechnology, most recently in his 2013 book, Radical Abundance, How a Revolution in Nanotechnology Will Change Civilization, K. Eric Drexler is clearly placing these developments in the context of the whole of human history, as does accomplished inventor and futurist Ray Kurzweil, founder of the Singularity University, in exploring the broader implications of technologies subject to exponential enhancement of their power and capabilities. And both the great scientist and activist Mei-Wan Ho, in her work as founding director of the Institute of Science and Society, and authors William McDonough and Michael Braungart, in their books Cradle to Cradle and Upcycle, call for recognition that making this historic transition to true global sustainability will almost certainly require creating a completely circular economy, where the very concept of waste is dissolved from the economic lexicon, analogizing biological systems where waste at one level is critical feedstock and input at another in an endless cycle of regeneration, very different from current economic practice. Finally, deservedly renowned theoretical ecologist Robert Ulanowitz, in his books A Third Window and Ecology, the Ascendant Perspective, begins to illuminate just how complex, subtle, and certainly dynamic the very notion of sustainability is, and why we should be very careful about throwing it around with the cavalier polemical presumption that truly achieving it can be realized with only minor tweaks here or there within an otherwise generally business as usual social, economic, institutional, and international institutional framework. All of this work, and much, much more, explicates very complementary perspectives that we have entered into a period of transition, the depth, breadth, interconnectedness, and significance of which is, with no hint of exaggeration, quite simply unprecedented in human history. And note, I did not say civilized history, but simply human history, period, full stop. If these few citations and comments have at least begun to make the case that there is a case to be made that we are in the early stages of a truly epochal global transition, and one with many overlapping and interacting dimensions and layers, this raises highly non-trivial questions and issues about our processes of local, regional, national, and international ecological, economic, and political governance. But the question before us here is why this should entail some special burden or change in the practices and procedures of the Fourth Estate. While there are many ways that one might answer this rhetorical question, one way is to simply ask whether the sources that you currently rely on for public affairs reporting are even asking, let alone actually seeking answers to questions related to how effectively we are navigating the demands which successfully making this great transition actually entail. Are they linked with forums enabling you to hone the future focus of, or to directly contribute to reportage on such issues, or to facilitate your political engagement in voicing how and what decisions should be made on such questions. Given the virtually reflexive orientation of so much of putative news or public affairs media on topicality, short-term incident, usually crisis, and or muckraking and gotcha journalism, it is hard to imagine that there would be very many affirmative answers to such a question. If correct, not only does this suggest a serious disconnect between the reality of our circumstances, the reality of being in the midst of this massive global transformation, and the importance our founders assigned to a fourth estate, which not only places a check on power, but one which provides the citizenry with the information and knowledge critically necessary for them to fulfill their own responsibilities for self-governance. And this reality certainly renders us partially blind for purposes of navigating this historic transition. While none of this is to suggest that topical, incident, crisis, and muckraking reportage are not also perfectly legitimate functions of the fourth estate, it most definitely is to suggest that the conventional journalistic concept of, quote, story, unquote, is highly problematic and insufficient in our current and foreseeable context. And why this is so relates precisely to the issues of multidimensionality and complexity, and the fact that these tend to entail processes of interactivity and feedback which defy the convenience of the kind of thematic silos so often characterizing the conventional idea of story. And this then begins to take us into what the imperative report venue is intended to be and to do, and why and how it would be different. The core of what distinguishes the orientation toward reportage envisioned for the imperative report is predicated in the observation and conviction that neither the existing conventional news/journalistic media nor the emerging citizen journalism associated with quote-unquote new media are fulfilling their constitutionally intended socio-political mandate remotely adequately in the context of this unprecedented transition underway. The following excerpts from the incisive 2010 book by political scientists Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson, Winner Take All Politics, provides a strong statement of support. Quote, "Those who see politics as electoral spectacle frequently assume that it's easy for voters to figure out who to shoot, that is, which policies to support or oppose, which politicians to vote in and out of office. But to form grounded views and votes, citizens need important resources that are too often lacking. Perhaps the most important is knowledge. Knowledge of the problems that concern them. We can be pretty sure of one thing. The help voters need is not consistently coming from the news media." Unquote. And to be continued.